Call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you. I beg to move that the committees consider the draft Community Radio Order 2025, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Jardine. I am pleased to be speaking to this order, which was laid before the House in draft on the 10th of December 2024. For most of us, radio still plays an important part in our day-to-day lives. Almost 90% of UK adults tune into the radio each week, where they find trusted news, entertainment and music. At the heart of radio's popularity is the relationship between the station and the listener, and the role that stations can play within communities. Radio consistently remains among the most trusted forms of media, with Ofcom reporting that radio is rated highly in terms of accuracy, trustworthiness and impartiality. Community radio has established itself as an integral part of this wider radio landscape, from Represent FM in Brixton to Pemmican FM not far from my own constituency of Barnsley South. These stations play a vital role in providing truly local services for the areas they broadcast to, while also catering for the diverse needs and interests of specific groups. Now, I have seen firsthand the value that these stations can offer to communities. In November, I visited the community radio station Cambridge 105 as part of Journalism Masters Week. This station produces a range of important content, from local news to women's sports programmes, and is run almost entirely by volunteers. Similarly, in December, I was interviewed by a young volunteer journalist, Grace, on Spark Sunderland community radio station. This highlighted how important the training opportunities that are offered by community stations really are. For many people at the very beginning of their media careers, they work as a springboard to the next stage. Like Cambridge 105 and Spark Sunderland, community radio stations up and down the country exist at the centre of wider local media ecosystems. There are now more than 300 analogue community radio services in existence, the first of which launched in 2005 under a Labour government, as well as around 80 new DAB-only services. The work and dedication of volunteers is what makes community radio so distinct and special. Working with limited resources and often juggling multiple other commitments, these volunteers are dedicated to providing an important local service for the communities they serve. It is these core principles that distinguish community radio from commercial radio. The core model from community radio, that community radio stations are local, not-for-profit organisations providing social gain to the communities they serve, remains a sound one. It is a model that has delivered a wider variety of services with a diversity unmatched in other media. However, the UK's radio landscape and listening habits have evolved considerably over the past 20 years. As new means of accessing radio and audio content develop, nearly 75% of all radio listening is now digital, and FM accounts for less than 20% of commercial radio listening. The government believes that whilst FM services need to continue till at least 2030, we can't ignore the wider implications of these changes, and we also need to support community radio stations to develop their services for future long-term sustainability. Although more and more community stations are now coming onto DAB thanks to the availability of small-scale DAB digital radio networks, we recognise that analogue broadcasting continues to represent the majority of community radio listening, and this is likely to continue to be the case over the coming years. It is therefore essential that consideration is given to the future of these licences and the best way to secure their stability for community radio stations in the medium to long term. The previous government sought views on whether licences should be extended again, and if so, for how long. The consultation ran from the 8th of November 2023 to the 31st of January 2024. The vast majority of responses were in favour of continuing the policy of renewals. Most respondents were more strongly in favour of a 10-year licence renewal, as this would provide more certainty for community stations into the mid-2030s. The consultation also sought views on whether the restrictions placed on community radio's capacity to generate revenue through advertising and sponsorship were still needed. And having considered these representations from both commercial and community radio, we believe it is necessary to retain an increased restriction on a very small number of community stations that broadcast in areas with smaller markets where there is an independent local commercial station. However, we are conscious the restrictions have not been reviewed since 2015. The draft order would therefore increase this revenue-raising restriction from £15,000 to £30,000. The draft community radio order includes provisions enabling Ofcom to extend community radio licences by 10-year periods. It will allow them to remove the advertising and sponsorship restrictions for the majority of stations, helping to simplify regulations and hopefully grow the sector. We've also consolidated the community radio order, enabling the repeal of 3 amendment orders in 2011, 2015 and 2019, which will help simplify the regulations for stations and Ofcom. The order has been considered by the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments and the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. Neither committee raised any concerns about the legislation. The Government firmly believes in the value of community radio and believes the changes will help support the sector's long-term health and sustainability. These measures will ensure that these ecosystems thrive, remaining trusted sources of local information within communities, while also providing a balanced level of regulatory oversight to maintain stability in the sector. However, these changes are only the starting point of our ongoing efforts to support and enhance the role of community stations and small independent commercial radio stations within communities. I met with the Community Media Association and the UK Community Radio Network last month to hear their views on how else the government might support community radio. We also recently announced plans to develop a local media strategy in recognition of the importance of this vital sector. And as part of this, we are looking at the scope to enhance and support the community radio sector, including by considering its request to review the budget for the Community Radio Fund. I'm pleased to be able to allocate an extra £50,000 this year to the Community Radio Fund, taking the budget for 24-25 to £450,000. I want to do more here in future years, but that is of course dependent on decisions the government will take in the spending review. So let me conclude by recalling that it was a Labour government under Tessa Jowell that first licensed community radio. We now want it to do what it can to enable the sector to grow and thrive in the years to come. I commend the draft order to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Community Radio Order 2025. Shadow Minister French.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. It's always a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Community radio serves a vital purpose in society and especially to local communities by providing services for the good of members of the public or of particular communities. They have a specific role and their focus as a not-for-profit is to provide social gain, not commercial interests. However, we have some concerns that this order, although well-intentioned, risks restricting competition and weakening the very principles of community radio. For example, the extension of licences for community radio stations could come at the expense of new entrants. For new entrants, the order is a barrier to entry and cements the status of current operators. When the media landscape is evolving, with urban and rural communities wanting culturally relevant radio, does the Minister agree that this is potentially a limitation on growth of the sector? Not only does it restrict new entrants, as I've just said, but it also fails to offer any review process on the service currently provided by community radio stations. Therefore, has the Minister considered the benefits of a relicensing process as well as a review of existing licences to ensure that community radio stations are fulfilling their purpose to deliver social value and serve their communities? If the Minister does not intend to conduct a relicensing process or review existing licences, what action is she going to take to ensure that community radio stations are delivering social benefits and providing community-focused broadcasting? Finally, Mrs Chairman, I'm aware of issues relating to coverage, with many community radio stations reporting DAB coverage issues. This means that these stations are being prevented from serving their communities and from fulfilling their purpose as a community radio station. Will the Minister therefore tell us what assessments she or officials have made of coverage as a result of phasing out analogue radio in favour of small-scale DAB? Mr Chairman, I want to end how I started, highlighting the good work that community radio stations do. I hope that the Minister can see for this sector to grow and thrive, competition should not be restricted, and effective checks should be in place to ensure community radio stations are fulfilling their purpose to benefit society. Thank you.
Julia Buckley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her very comprehensive speech setting out the benefits of this order. And I'm particularly pleased to hear of her ongoing dialogue with the sector and the emerging strategy. Can she reassure members that these changes will not leave some of the smaller, perhaps rural stations left behind if, for example, they were unable to attract commercial support, because often they do represent those smaller, vulnerable, underrepresented parts of society?
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to conclude this debate, and I'm grateful for the contributions of members across the House. And I think it's clear from today's discussion that we, across the House, on every side, want to secure support for the community radio sector and ensure it thrives long into the future. These stations are often at the heart of communities in which they broadcast, and we want to ensure that they can continue to deliver local content to listeners. To respond to a couple of the points that were made specifically, and so in particular to the Shadow Minister, the consensus of views from the community radio sector was the system of renewals needed to be retained. An additional 10-year licence term would have benefits in giving stations the long-term stability to invest. We do see the argument that this could limit scope for new entrants, but we would point to other opportunities that groups have, including small-scale DAB and online, to establish a local radio service. And the points of both the Shadow Minister and my honourable friend in terms of coverage, it is a matter for Ofcom, and I am happy to write to Ofcom and raise it in one of my regular meetings with them. And so just to conclude, the value of community radio cannot be overstated. These services do not only provide local news and information, but they also deliver improved social outcomes through increasing the scope, quality and capability of community radio, including for underrepresented groups. This order will ensure that the invaluable work of these stations is protected and enabled to thrive. We want to foster communities that are home to diverse local media ecosystems. The measures in the Community Radio Order 2025 ensure that community radio can be part of these ecosystems long into the future, contributing to a plurality of choice and to the training of the next generation of radio broadcasters and producers. Very grateful to members for their contributions and the interest they have shown in the continued provision of community radio across the UK.
Thank you. The question is that the committee has considered the draft Community Radio Order 2025. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.